I've missed more than 9 Hors-la-Zone shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games, 26 times. I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I've failed over and over and over again in my life. And that is why I succeed. That quote is often used as motivational material, a poster, a caption on an Instagram reel, but listen to it again, more carefully. It is not a quote about bouncing back. It is not an inspiration speech. It is a statement about the architecture of a mind. Jordan is not saying, "Oh, I failed, and it was okay." He is saying, "I built failure into the system. I used it. I processed it. I converted it." That is the first thing you need to understand before we go any further. Michael Jordan was not simply a gifted athlete. He was a system. A deliberate, obsessively refined, relentlessly maintained mental system, operating inside a human body. This is an attempt to reverse engineer that system. The statistics alone cannot answer the question. Every generation produces gifted basketball players. Long before Jordan, the league had seen Bill Russell win 11 titles. It had seen Wilt Chamberlain score 100 points in a single game. It had seen Magic Johnson and Larry Bird redefine what a team player looked like. When Jordan arrived in Chicago in 1984 as a 21-year-old rookie from the University of North Carolina, he was not the first great player the league had seen. He was not even considered the best player in his own draft class by everyone in that room. The Portland Trail Blazers chose Sam Bowie over Jordan. They wanted a center. Stu Inman, the Trail Blazers general manager at the time, explained the decision simply. They needed a center. Bowie was the best available big man. You make those calls based on need. It became one of the most analyzed personnel decisions in sports history, not because Bowie was a bad player, he was talented, but because Jordan went on to become something that the league had never quite seen before. Not just dominant, not just great, systematically unstoppable. The question worth asking is not, how talented was Michael Jordan? Talent is too easy an answer. It ends the conversation before it starts. The question worth asking is, what mental framework allowed this particular human being to reach a level of sustained excellence that almost no athlete in any sport has approached? Why did he keep winning, even when the league changed its rules specifically to stop him? Why did players who were physically exceptional, players with every measurable advantage, lose to him consistently? Why, when he retired and came back, after a year and a half away from the sport, did he win 3 more championships? Talent explains some of that. But talent does not explain all of it. What explains the rest is a set of mental models, a collection of principles that he applied to his career with a consistency that bordered on the obsessive. That is what we are studying here. Michael Jeffrey Jordan was born on February 17, 1963 in Brooklyn, New York, and raised in Wilmington, North Carolina, the 4th of 5 children of James and Dolores Jordan. His childhood was not marked by poverty or profound hardship. The Jordan household was stable, structured, and disciplined. His father, James, worked at General Electric. His mother, Dolores, worked at a bank. They were a working-class family with values organized around work, accountability, and self-improvement. These were not incidental background details. They were the soil in which Jordan's psychology took root. In his sophomore year at Laney High School, Jordan tried out for the varsity basketball team. He was not selected. He was cut. A boy named Leroy Smith, who was taller, was chosen over him. This is one of the most repeated facts in sports history. It has become almost mythological, and like most myths, it has been simplified by retelling. Jordan was not a bad player. He was already good. But the varsity coach, Clifton Herring, preferred to work with older, bigger players. The cut lasted 1 season. Jordan was placed on the junior varsity team. He averaged nearly 30 points per game that year. But the psychological effect of that moment, the experience of being evaluated and found insufficient, became something that Jordan would carry with him for the rest of his career. He spoke about it directly, years later. Whenever he was working out and got tired and figured he ought to stop, he would close his eyes and see that list in the locker room without his name on it. That, he said, usually got him going again. This is the first pattern worth noting. Jordan did not process rejection as information about his limits. He processed it as fuel. He stored it, cataloged it, and returned to it when he needed motivation. This habit, the deliberate use of slights, real or imagined, as motivational material, would define his psychology for the next 30 years. Inside the Jordan household, competition was constant. Michael competed with his older brother Larry in the backyard every day after school. Larry Jordan was shorter than Michael, but fiercely physical. He won most of their early games. He was relentless. He did not go easy on his younger brother. Years later, Jordan would speak about those backyard games with a reverence that most athletes reserve for championship moments. His brother Larry, he said, was so competitive, so physical. He pushed him every single day. He didn't care that he was his brother. He wanted to win. And Jordan learned from that. He learned that being related doesn't mean anything on the court. In those backyard games, Jordan was forming a basic operating principle, one that he would apply later to teammates, rivals, coaches, and even equipment managers. The principle was simple. Competition does not pause for relationships. The game is the game. He was learning that lesson from Larry at age 11. James and Dolores Jordan were not passive parents. They were architects of their children's work ethic. James Jordan was mechanically gifted. He worked on cars. He built things. He believed in understanding how systems worked, in taking things apart and putting them back together. He passed this mindset to Michael directly, not through lectures, but through modeling. You saw how something broke down. You fixed it. You improved it. You did not accept it as it was if it could be better. Dolores Jordan provided a different kind of structure. She was organized, detail-oriented, and socially astute. She understood people. She read rooms. She held the family together through practicality. What Jordan inherited from these two people was a dual framework: the mechanical drive to understand and improve systems and the social intelligence to read other human beings. Both of those tools would shape how he approached basketball. Jordan chose the University of North Carolina over several other programs, including Duke and South Carolina, and enrolled in 1981. He was recruited by coach Dean Smith, one of the most respected tactical minds the game had produced. What Jordan found at Chapel Hill was not the individualistic, showcase environment he might have expected to thrive in. Dean Smith ran a team system. The ball moved. No individual was bigger than the offense. Even great players were expected to subordinate themselves to the structure. Jordan hit the game-winning shot as a freshman in the 1982 national championship game against Georgetown. That shot won North Carolina the title. But Dean Smith did not immediately anoint him a star. He maintained the system. He kept Jordan within its boundaries. Smith reflected on it later with characteristic directness. Michael could have been a lot more in terms of individual statistics at North Carolina, but he learned how to win. That was what they were teaching. Not how to score, how to win. Jordan chafed at the constraints in certain moments. He was already an exceptional talent, and part of him knew it, but he also absorbed what Smith was teaching. He learned that systems win, that individual excellence, when channeled correctly through a team structure, becomes exponentially more powerful. He would spend much of the next decade at war with himself over this lesson, needing both the individual spotlight and the team framework. But the lesson was already in him. What follows is not a chronological biography. It is an attempt to identify the recurring mental principles that defined how Jordan operated across his entire career. Each principle is illustrated with specific moments. Each principle recurs, not once, but again and again across decades. That recurrence is the point. A trait that appears once is an anecdote. A trait that appears consistently across 20 years and in different contexts and under different pressures is a principle. These are Jordan's principles. The first principle is what might be called the inventory of slights. Michael Jordan maintained a mental ledger of every slight, every dismissal, every moment of disrespect he experienced throughout his career. He did not let these moments go. He deliberately held on to them. He filed them away. And when he needed an extra edge, he returned to that ledger and drew from it. This was not an unconscious process. Jordan has spoken about it directly, multiple times, throughout his career and in retirement. He knew he was doing it. He chose to do it. He refined it into a tool. Before the 1997 NBA Finals, Utah Jazz guard Brian Russell made an offhand comment in an interview suggesting that he could guard Jordan. It was not an outrageous claim. Russell was a competent defender. He had guarded Jordan before and held his own. Jordan heard the comment. He cataloged it. In Game 6 of that series, the game that would decide the championship, Jordan got the ball at the top of the key with Utah leading by 1 and the final seconds ticking down. He was being guarded by Brian Russell. What happened next is one of the most studied moments in basketball history. Jordan dribbled right. He used a crossover that sent Russell stumbling. He pulled up for a mid-range jumper. The shot went in. Chicago won the championship. After the ball went through the net, Jordan held his pose, right arm extended, wrist bent, eyes tracking the shot. He stood in that pose for a long moment before the celebration began. It was not just a championship shot. It was the closing of a ledger entry. Jordan explained it simply afterward. Russell had said he could guard him, so he had to show him. That, he said, was just the way he thought. This pattern, storing perceived slights and using them as fuel, appears throughout Jordan's career in consistent and sometimes extraordinary ways. In 1993, before the Eastern Conference Finals against the New York Knicks, Knicks center Patrick Ewing made comments dismissing the Bulls' chances. Jordan scored 46 points in Game 1. During the 1992 Olympics, Jordan became deeply motivated by the fact that FIBA rules had initially threatened to prevent him from wearing Nike gear since the Dream Team's official sponsor was Reebok. Jordan draped himself in an American flag at the medal ceremony to cover the Reebok logo. This was not an accident. It was a principled response to a perceived institutional disrespect. Even within the Bulls organization, Jordan would find perceived slights to leverage. When general manager Jerry Krause said that organizations win championships, not players, Jordan used that comment as fuel for years. He brought it up repeatedly. He built narrative around it. The remarkable thing is not that Jordan used motivation in this way. Many athletes use external motivation. What is remarkable is the deliberateness of the system. Jordan did not accidentally get angry when disrespected. He manufactured the anger at will by recalling stored material. Sustained excellence requires sustained motivation. For many athletes, motivation peaks in moments of urgency. A must-win game, a playoff series, a championship moment. Then it fades. Jordan solved this problem by building a personal motivation infrastructure. The ledger of slights ensured that he was never without material. There was always another slight to return to, always another entry to close. This created a psychological state that coaches and teammates frequently described as unsettling to observe. Jordan did not look like a man who needed to motivate himself. He looked like a man who had been wronged and was in the process of correcting the record. Every single time he stepped on a court. The second principle is the standard of practice. Jordan did not practice to prepare for games. He practiced as if the practice itself were a performance of the highest order. He applied game-level intensity to every training session, every drill, every 2-on-2 pickup game in the Bulls practice facility. This is a principle that sounds simple. Train hard. Work more than the competition. Coaches say it constantly. But Jordan's version of this principle went beyond intensity. It went into the architecture of how he thought about practice itself. He believed that the standard you hold in practice becomes the ceiling of your potential in games, and he believed that the ceiling should always be moving upward. Numerous accounts from Bulls teammates across multiple eras describe the same phenomenon. Jordan would arrive at practice before anyone else. He would have completed a full individual workout before the team session began. But it was not just the quantity of work, it was the quality of the confrontation he created. In practice scrimmages, Jordan played to win with the same ferocity he brought to playoff games. He did not ease up. He did not allow teammates to coast. He challenged them, goaded them, provoked them, anything to raise the level of the competition. Horace Grant, who played alongside Jordan from 1987 to 1994, described the experience of Bulls practice as more physically and mentally demanding than many actual games. "Practice was brutal," he said. "Michael didn't give you anything. He came after you every day like it was the 7th game of the finals. And if you couldn't handle it, he didn't have time for you. That was just the reality." Steve Kerr, who played with Jordan on 3 championship teams and who later became one of the most successful coaches in the league, has a well-documented story about practice during the 1994 to 1995 season. Jordan, in one of the Bulls' hard competitive practice sessions, punched Kerr in the face. The details of the incident have been told in various forms. What everyone agrees on is that Jordan pushed the practice confrontation to a point that resulted in physical contact. Jordan later apologized, one of the few reported apologies of this kind in his career. But the underlying behavior, the refusal to lower the standard of practice competition, never changed. Kerr reflected on it clearly. Jordan made them all better by being who he was. But it wasn't comfortable. He didn't care about comfortable, he cared about winning. Perhaps the most illuminating account of Jordan's practice standard comes from Shaquille O'Neal, who encountered Jordan in practice situations at various points in their careers, most notably at Team USA events and exhibition settings. O'Neal has described Jordan as the only player he encountered who made him feel genuinely uncomfortable during practice, not because of physical imposing presence, but because of psychological intensity. This trait, practice's performance, appears consistently across Jordan's career in 3 distinct phases. In his early years with the Bulls, from 1984 to 1989, when the team had not yet won a championship and was widely seen as a vehicle for Jordan's individual brilliance rather than a championship contender, Jordan maintained this practice standard even when winning seemed distant. He was not training for an immediate goal. He was building a habit of excellence. In his championship years, from 1991 to 1993, and then again from 1996 to 1998, the practice standard became the mechanism by which the Bulls maintained their edge. As teams studied them more carefully, as defenses became more sophisticated in responding to Jordan's tendencies, the practice environment allowed the Bulls to solve problems before they became game problems. In his return from his first retirement in 1995, Jordan spent months at the University of North Carolina practicing in relative obscurity before his official return. He scored 13 points in his second game back, a number that surprised observers who expected immediate dominance. But he had not simply picked the ball back up. He had rebuilt the practice habit first. By the end of that playoff run, he was scoring 40-plus against Orlando. The practice infrastructure had reasserted itself. The relationship between practice intensity and game performance is well understood in theory. What makes Jordan's version of this principle worth studying is the consistency of its application under conditions that would have eroded most athletes' commitment. Late in his career, when his body was less able to recover from extreme training loads, Jordan adapted the form of his practice without abandoning the principle. He shifted from explosive athleticism to precision skill work. He refined rather than reinvented. But he never reduced the standard of engagement. The practice standard was not a phase. It was a permanent operating mode. The third principle is the study of opponents. Jordan did not simply play against opponents. He studied them the way a scientist studies a problem, systematically, with curiosity, looking for the pattern beneath the pattern. He wanted to know not just what opponents did, but why they did it, what their instincts were, what decisions they made automatically, what situations made them uncomfortable, what made them predictable. This was film study as intelligence gathering, and it shaped everything from his defensive positioning to his verbal exchanges during games. Brendan Malone, who served as an assistant coach with the Bulls during their first championship run in the early 1990s, has described Jordan's approach to film study in specific terms. Jordan would not simply watch a player's highlights, he would study tendencies under pressure. Where does this player go when he's tired? What direction does this ball handler prefer after 2 hours on the court? What shot does this scorer take when his preferred option is removed? He built mental dossiers on every significant opponent. And when he guarded a player, he was not simply reacting. He was executing a prepared defensive game plan that he had built through hours of film work. Doc Rivers, who played against Jordan and later became one of the most respected coaches in the league, put it directly. Michael came in knowing what you were going to do before you did it. He'd studied you. He knew your habits better than you knew them yourself. That was frightening to play against. The clearest illustration of this principle in action is Jordan's defensive work. He won the Defensive Player of the Year award in 1988, an almost unheard of achievement for a scoring guard in that era. He was named to the NBA All-Defensive Team 9 times. His defensive excellence was not primarily physical. He was fast and athletic, but so were many guards of his era. What set him apart on defense was anticipation, the ability to be in the right place before the ball arrived, based on having internalized his opponent's decision-making patterns. This same film study informed his offensive game in a different way. Jordan studied how defenses were designed to stop him. He understood the tactical adjustments that coaches made against him, and he adapted before the adaptation could be fully implemented. Gary Payton, one of the premier defensive guards of Jordan's era, acknowledged it without hesitation. Jordan would say things during games that showed you he'd been watching you. He'd tell you what you were going to do before you did it. Sometimes he'd be wrong, but not often. The pattern of systematic opponent study runs from Jordan's early career through to his final years with the Washington Wizards. In his early years, without the benefit of sophisticated film technology, he watched tape on portable projectors. He took notes. He built mental models of opponents by hand. In his championship years with the Bulls, he worked closely with the coaching staff, particularly with Tex Winter, who designed the triangle offense, to understand not just individual opponents, but how defenses were designed as systems. He learned to read team defensive schemes the way a quarterback reads a defense at the line of scrimmage. Even in his final season with Washington in 2003, at age 40 with diminished physical tools, his basketball intelligence, built on 20 years of systematic opponent study, allowed him to remain effective at moments when pure athleticism would have failed him. Athletic excellence without tactical intelligence has a ceiling. It produces great individual moments, but not sustained dominance. Tactical intelligence without physical tools produces coaching, not playing. What Jordan built was a fusion of elite physical tools and elite tactical preparation. The result was a player who was simultaneously harder to guard than anyone you had physically prepared for, and harder to defend against than anyone you had schemed against on a whiteboard. The study of opponents was the intellectual infrastructure beneath the physical performance. The fourth principle is the will to adapt. Most athletes, when their physical gifts begin to decline, find one of two paths. They accept diminishment, or they push harder against it, burning out what remains of their body in an attempt to maintain the old version of themselves. Jordan chose a third path. He rebuilt. When it became clear that the aerial, physically dominant version of Michael Jordan, the version that averaged 37 points in 1987 and won dunk contests and flew across the lane with effortless elasticity, could not survive forever, Jordan began constructing a new version. He developed a mid-range jump shot of extraordinary precision. He developed post moves. He developed a fadeaway jumper that required almost no separation from the defender, because it was released from a point the defender could not reach without fouling him. He did not just add tools, he built an entirely new offensive identity. Tim Grover, Jordan's personal trainer from 1989 until Jordan's retirement, has described the transformation in specific terms. When Jordan first approached Grover in 1989, he wanted to become stronger and more durable. The Detroit Pistons, who would deny him 3 consecutive playoff series, were physically beating him up. He wanted the physical tools to withstand it. What resulted from that work was not just a stronger Jordan, it was a more deliberate Jordan. The strength work changed how he moved through contact. And the change in how he moved through contact changed his thinking about how to score. By the early 1990s, he was no longer trying to get past defenders. He was trying to get to specific spots on the floor where he had trained his body to perform reliably under any defensive pressure. Grover described the arc of that transformation with precision. When he first started working with Jordan, he was already great, but he was relying on what he could do naturally. By the time they were done, Jordan could go to spots that nobody could defend, because he'd made himself unstoppable at those specific points on the floor. That was the transformation. The most visible evidence of this principle came after Jordan's return from his first retirement in 1995. He had been away from professional basketball for approximately 18 months. He had played baseball in the minor leagues. His body had changed. His athleticism was slightly diminished. He came back and won 3 more championships. The player who won those championships in 1996, 1997, and 1998 was not the same player who had won in 1991, 1992, and 1993. He was physically older, less explosive, more deliberate, but the mental architecture had been upgraded during the absence. The fadeaway was sharper, the postgame was more sophisticated, the decision-making was more economical. The pattern of reinvention appears at 3 distinct inflection points in Jordan's career. First, after the Detroit Pistons physically defeated him in consecutive playoff series in 1988, 1989, and 1990. Jordan responded not by trying to shoot over or through the Pistons more. He responded by rebuilding his body and his game to be able to withstand their pressure. Second, after his first retirement from 1993 to 1995, the athlete who returned was built around a different set of tools than the athlete who had left. The second version was arguably more efficient, if less electrifying. Third, at Washington from 2001 to 2003. At 38 and 39 years old, Jordan used the tools he had: elite basketball intelligence, the mid-range jump shot, the post moves, the ability to read defenses, to remain a 20-point scorer. He averaged 22 points per game in his final season at Washington. That number is achieved through craft, not athleticism. The will to adapt is rare because it requires something that most elite competitors find psychologically difficult: acknowledging that the current version of yourself is insufficient. Jordan made that acknowledgement repeatedly, across multiple transitions. Each time, he made it not with resignation, but with methodical purpose. He identified what was no longer working. He built something new to replace it. He applied the new tools with the same intensity he had applied the old ones. This is not a story about aging gracefully. It is a story about a mind that refused to accept the premise that improvement had a terminal point. The 5th principle is the leader who demanded. Jordan's leadership style was not the style that appears in most books on the subject. He did not lead through inspiration speeches. He did not lead through patience or affirmation. He led through demand. He set a standard for himself that was nearly inhuman in its intensity, and then he expected his teammates to meet it. When they fell short, he told them so, directly, forcefully, and often publicly. This approach to leadership is controversial. It caused significant friction, damaged relationships, and was not universally effective. Some players responded to it and were elevated by it. Others found it corrosive and were ultimately unable to function under its pressure. But for the players who could handle it, Jordan's demanding leadership style produced something that softer approaches rarely achieve: a genuine raising of the performance floor. Scottie Pippen is one of the most important figures in understanding Jordan's leadership style because their relationship illustrates both the power and the cost of Jordan's approach. When Pippen arrived in Chicago in 1987, he was a talented but unformed player. Raw athleticism, uncertain mechanics, no established role. Jordan made him, literally and figuratively. In practice, Jordan tested Pippen constantly. He went at him hard. He challenged him publicly. He refused to treat him gently. Pippen's response was to match the challenge. Over 3 seasons, he became arguably the second best player in the league: a defensive force, a versatile offensive contributor, a leader in his own right. Pippen described it from his own perspective with clarity. Michael challenged him every day. He didn't baby him, he came after him. And Pippen had a choice: either rise to it or get out of the way. He chose to rise. But the story has another dimension. Pippen also experienced moments of profound friction with Jordan. There were public confrontations. There were perceived slights. Jordan, in interviews and in practice, sometimes undermined Pippen's confidence in ways that observers found unnecessarily harsh. In the Last Dance documentary, Pippen spoke about certain aspects of Jordan's leadership, particularly a moment during the 1995 comeback when Jordan publicly questioned Pippen's commitment, with clear residual pain even decades later. This is the cost of Jordan's leadership model. It was not designed to make people feel good. It was designed to make people better. Sometimes those 2 objectives are in direct conflict. Jordan acknowledged the tension directly. He could have been nicer, he said, but whether they would have been as good, he wasn't sure about that. The relationship with Tony Kukoc provides another illustration. When Kukoc was brought to the Bulls as a potential star, with considerable fanfare from general manager Jerry Krause, Jordan and Pippen conspired during the 1992 Olympics to demolish Kukoc publicly on the court. They guarded him personally. They shut him down. It looked to outside observers like two established stars protecting their territory from a perceived interloper. But there was a leadership logic to it. Kukoc needed to understand what it felt like to be guarded by that level. He needed to know what was expected of him in the NBA. The message was delivered on a court, not in a meeting room. Kukoc went on to become a key contributor to 2 of Chicago's 3 second-run championships. The pattern of demanding leadership appears consistently in Jordan's relationships with role players who became champions. B.J. Armstrong, who played point guard for 3 Chicago championship teams, has described Jordan's demands in practice as the primary driver of his own development as a player. Ron Harper, brought to Chicago in 1994 and initially skeptical of the intense team culture, became a defensive anchor for the second three-peat. His development under Jordan's demanding standard was a significant part of that story. Even Phil Jackson, Jordan's coach for all 6 championships, operated within a framework where Jordan's standard set the tone. Jackson designed systems. Jordan enforced the standard of execution. The division was clear and productive. Leadership through demand is not universally applicable. It requires a specific set of conditions, a leader whose own performance makes the demands credible, a culture in which high standards are shared values rather than imposed expectations, and teammates capable of responding to confrontation rather than being diminished by it. Jordan had all 3. His own performance was beyond question. The Bulls' organizational culture, under Phil Jackson, supported a demanding environment, and Jordan perhaps instinctively selected and retained relationships with teammates who were capable of meeting his standard. The result was a team that, at its peak, functioned as a collective expression of Jordan's individual standard. The 6th principle is the relationship with failure. Jordan lost. He lost in ways that were painful, public, and consequential. He lost 3 consecutive playoff series to the Detroit Pistons between 1988 and 1990. He was physically overwhelmed, psychologically frustrated, and in those years clearly not yet equipped to beat the team that stood between him and a championship. He lost the 1995 playoff series to the Orlando Magic after his return from retirement. The team was not ready. He was not ready. In his second stint with Washington, he lost, often in difficult fashion, on a struggling team that was not capable of competing at the level his mind still demanded. How Jordan processed these losses is one of the most psychologically interesting dimensions of his career. Between 1988 and 1990, the Detroit Pistons eliminated the Chicago Bulls from the playoffs 3 times. Each elimination was painful. The Pistons had constructed a specific defensive strategy, which became publicly known as the Jordan Rules, designed to physically punish Jordan every time he touched the ball. The strategy was brutal. Double teams, physical contact on every shot, hits that would be technical fouls by contemporary standards. The goal was not simply to stop Jordan, but to wear him down until he could not function. It worked. For 3 years, it worked. How Jordan responded to these losses is the crucial data point. After the 1989 loss, Jordan did not immediately campaign for different personnel or blame the organization. He went to Tim Grover and began a physical transformation program. After the 1990 loss, he returned to practice immediately and began integrating his teammates more deliberately into the offensive system. He began, perhaps for the first time in his career, to genuinely invest in making the team better as a collective unit, rather than viewing his teammates as support staff for his individual excellence. Jordan spoke about it with honesty. "Those losses hurt," he said. "They were supposed to hurt. If they hadn't hurt, he would have been in the wrong business. But what he didn't do was sit around thinking about how unfair it was. He thought about what he needed to change." In 1991, the Bulls swept the Pistons in the Eastern Conference Finals. The Pistons, who had won back-to-back championships in 1989 and 1990, were eliminated decisively. As the Pistons walked off the court in the final moments of that series, they chose not to shake hands with the Bulls. Jordan has been asked about this moment many times. His response is revealing. He said he didn't need them to shake his hand. The game, he said, shook his hand. The pattern in Jordan's relationship with failure is not a simple one of resilience. It is more structured than that. What Jordan consistently did in response to defeat was perform a specific analytical sequence. First, allow the pain of the loss to exist. Do not suppress it. Do not rationalize it. Feel it fully. Second, extract the technical lesson. What were the tactical reasons for the defeat? What changed and what needs to change in response? Third, convert the emotional residue, the pain, the frustration, the humiliation, into motivational material for the ledger of slights. The process was not comfortable. Jordan has spoken about how difficult the Detroit losses were, how genuine his frustration was, how seriously he questioned whether he would ever be able to overcome that level of physical opposition. But the process was never allowed to become paralysis. The ability to process failure without being destroyed by it and without minimizing its significance is one of the rarest attributes in elite competition. Most athletes manage one side of this equation, but not both. Some are so afraid of failure that they avoid the risks that lead to growth. Some are so careless about failure that they do not extract its lessons. Jordan held both sides simultaneously. He felt failure fully, so he could learn from it precisely, and then he converted it so that it fueled rather than blocked his next effort. The seventh principle is the relationship between the system and the individual. For much of his early career, Jordan was widely viewed, and largely functioned, as a solo performer inside a team structure. He was the architect of his own offense. He took the shots he wanted. He imposed his will on the game directly. The Chicago Bulls management, their early coaches, and much of the basketball world accepted this model. He was so good that it seemed unnecessary to demand otherwise. But the championships did not come during this period. When Phil Jackson arrived as head coach in 1989 and installed the triangle offense, a system that required all 5 players to read and react to the defense together, with no single player guaranteed the ball at any given moment, Jordan faced the most significant intellectual challenge of his professional life. The triangle offense, designed by Tex Winter, is one of the most cognitively demanding systems in basketball. It requires constant reading of defensive positioning. It produces spacing and ball movement that creates open looks, not through isolation, but through collective intelligence. Jordan's initial reaction to being asked to operate within it was resistance. He was already the best player in the league. He was already creating offense at a historic level. Why should he reduce himself to a component within a system? Jackson's persuasive approach was characteristically indirect. He did not confront Jordan on the question of ego. He presented the triangle as a way to make Jordan's excellence more sustainable and less stoppable. Jackson put it clearly. He told Michael, "You can win scoring titles every year, but scoring titles won't stop teams from building entire defensive systems around stopping you personally. The triangle makes every player a threat, which means every player becomes your weapon." Jordan absorbed this argument, and then he did something that revealed the depth of his basketball intelligence. He mastered the system. He did not merely comply with the triangle. He internalized it. He understood its principles at a level that allowed him to operate within it while still imposing his individual will at the moments when the system created the optimal opportunity. What resulted was a fusion. The triangle created space, movement, and unpredictability. Jordan's individual excellence exploited that space with lethal precision. Scottie Pippen articulated the effect from inside the system. Once Michael understood the triangle, he said, nobody could guard him or them, because now you couldn't load up on him. You had to guard all 5 people. And if you did that, Michael would score 40. The pattern of initial resistance followed by deep mastery, followed by creative exploitation, appears at multiple junctures in Jordan's career. When the rules of the game changed to limit hand-checking and increase offensive freedom in the mid-1990s, Jordan had to understand how the new rule set changed defensive positioning and then adapted his offensive approach accordingly. When international caliber players began entering the NBA in greater numbers in the late 1990s, bringing different defensive schemes and physical approaches, Jordan studied their tendencies and incorporated them into his own tactical planning. In every case, the pattern was the same. Jordan respected good systems. He did not fight them. He learned them, and then he used them. The most sophisticated version of competitive excellence is not pure individual dominance. It is the ability to channel individual excellence through structural intelligence, to become more powerful by understanding the system rather than fighting against it. Jordan's mastery of the triangle offense is one of the clearest illustrations of this principle in sports history. A less intelligent competitor would have rejected the system as an imposition. Jordan recognized it as an amplifier. The championships followed immediately. The 8th principle is the body as an instrument. Jordan's relationship with his body was not that of a natural athlete who trusted his gifts. It was the relationship of a craftsman with his primary tool. He understood, from relatively early in his career, that his physical capabilities were the infrastructure that allowed everything else to function. And he treated that infrastructure with corresponding care. This manifested in the relationship with Tim Grover, which began in 1989 and extended through Jordan's playing career. Grover was not simply a trainer, he was a physical systems analyst. He studied Jordan's body the way Jordan studied opponents, looking for vulnerabilities, inefficiencies, and opportunities for improvement. When Jordan first contacted Grover in 1989, Grover was a relatively unknown trainer working with high school and college athletes in Chicago. Jordan reached out based on a recommendation. He was specific about what he wanted. He wanted to be stronger. He wanted to be more durable, and he wanted to be in better condition than any other player in the league at the end of a game. That last point is worth pausing on. Jordan was not asking to be the strongest player in the league. He was not asking to be the most muscular. He was asking to be in the best condition at the end of games, because late in games, under fatigue, is when championships are decided. Grover remembered the conversation precisely. Jordan told him from the beginning, "I don't need to be the biggest guy out there. I need to be the sharpest one when everybody else is tired." That was the goal, and that was what they built. The physical transformation that followed was significant. Jordan added functional strength, not bulk, but the kind of structural durability that allows an athlete to absorb contact without losing balance or precision. More important than the transformation itself was the process Grover describes, Jordan's extraordinary attention to his own physical feedback. He was hyper-attuned to how his body felt. He communicated specifically about what was working and what wasn't. He treated physical training as a precise science, not an ordeal to be endured. The pattern of treating the body as an instrument appears across Jordan's career in several forms. Jordan was attentive to what affected his performance. He understood, intuitively and through experience, how certain choices affected his energy and recovery. His energy management, knowing when to rest, when to compete, when to conserve, was extraordinarily sophisticated. He played cards and socialized during road trips, sometimes well into the night. This has been cited by some critics as a contradiction of the preparation ethic, but those who observed him closely noted that Jordan seemed to understand his own rhythms at a level most athletes never develop. In Game 5 of the 1997 NBA Finals against the Utah Jazz, Jordan played through what was widely reported as a severe illness. Some accounts describe it as food poisoning. He scored 38 points. The Bulls won the game. Jordan was photographed being supported by teammates as he left the court. This moment is often cited as evidence of toughness. It is that. But it is also evidence of something more specific, the ability to compartmentalize physical distress and continue executing at a high level. That ability is a trained skill. It comes from years of practicing performance under discomfort. Physical gifts without physical maintenance are a depreciating asset. Jordan understood this at a point in his career when many athletes, young, dominant, untouched by injury, have not yet learned it. The relationship with Grover began at 26 years old. Jordan was not injured. He was not in decline. He was at the peak of his powers. And yet he was already investing in extending and maintaining those powers because he understood that the body was the foundation, and the foundation required constant attention. The ninth principle is the performance identity. For most professional athletes, the game is a professional activity. It is what they do for a living. It defines their public image and their financial security. But at a deep psychological level, it remains separate from their sense of self. When they lose, they are professionals who had a bad night. When they retire, they are former athletes finding new identities. Jordan's relationship with basketball was categorically different. For Jordan, the performance identity, the identity of competitor, of winner, of the best, was not a professional role. It was his entire self-concept. This created extraordinary intensity on the court. It also created significant difficulty off it. In October 1993, 6 months after his third consecutive championship, and immediately following the murder of his father, James Jordan, Michael Jordan retired from professional basketball for the first time. He was 30 years old. He was the best player in the world. There was no physical reason to stop. The public explanation was the loss of his desire to play. The private explanation, which Jordan has articulated more fully in the years since, was more complex. The game had taken everything. The competitive drive was so total, so consuming, that it had come to feel like a force that was extracting from him rather than expressing him. He needed to be someone other than Michael Jordan, the basketball player. He needed to be, briefly, a minor league baseball player. Anonymous, struggling, learning, just to remember what it felt like to exist outside the performance identity. He spoke about it with unusual candor. He just needed to find out who he was outside of basketball, whether he could be a normal person, whether Michael Jordan, the man, could function without Michael Jordan, the basketball player, being there. What the baseball period revealed, and what Jordan himself has been candid about, is that the performance identity was too deeply embedded to simply set aside. He was not, in any fundamental sense, fulfilled by minor league baseball. He was going through the motions of an ordinary life, and the ordinary life was not what he had been built for. When he returned in 1995, it was not simply a decision to play basketball again. It was a recognition that the performance identity was not something he could retire from. It was the structure of his psychology. He described the realization with precision. He realized he didn't want to be anything else. He wanted to be a basketball player. Not just play basketball, be a basketball player. That, he said, was different. The performance identity pattern is most visible in the moments when Jordan was asked to exist outside of it. His gambling, a topic he has discussed with varying degrees of openness over the years, is often analyzed through a moral lens, but the psychological interpretation may be more illuminating. Jordan gambled at stakes that most observers found alarming. He gambled during the playoffs, during team trips, in high-stakes card games. What is consistent in the accounts of those who knew him is that the gambling served the same function as the basketball. It created a competitive arena, a space where winning and losing carried genuine consequences, where performance was constantly tested against other people's performance. Jordan did not gamble to relax. He gambled to compete. The drive required an outlet. The same dynamic appears in his golf game, played at a furious, betting-intensive competitive level, and in his business career after retirement, where he pursued the purchase and management of an NBA franchise with the same hunger for ownership and control that had defined his playing days. The performance identity is a double-edged framework. On one side, it provides an inexhaustible source of motivation and purpose. When your identity is the performance, every performance carries existential weight. You cannot give less than everything, because you cannot conceive of yourself outside of the effort. On the other side, it creates fragility around the performance itself. Jordan has spoken honestly about the difficulty of retirement, of finding himself in a world where the competition was abstract rather than immediate, where the ledger of slights could no longer be closed on a court. But during the playing years, this total identification with the performance was one of the primary drivers of sustained excellence. When your basketball identity and your personal identity are the same thing, there's no off switch. The 10th principle is the winner's standard. Michael Jordan won 10 scoring titles. He was named league MVP 5 times. He was named to the All-NBA team 11 times. He was the Defensive Player of the Year. If Jordan had retired in 1990, having never won a championship, the statistical record alone would have placed him among the greatest players in the history of the sport. Jordan did not accept this. He did not accept individual honors as a substitute for team success. He defined his standard in terms of championships alone. Everything else was preparation. This distinction between accepting the available reward and insisting on the highest possible standard is one of the clearest expressions of Jordan's mental framework. After the Bulls won their first championship in 1991, the natural response to 3 years of consecutive playoff failures would have been to celebrate with prolonged relief. Jordan celebrated, and then he returned to work. The response to winning was not different in kind from the response to losing. In both cases, the next step was preparation. The standard did not become easier because the championship had been won, it became higher. Tex Winter, who coached Jordan through all 6 championships, observed that Jordan's psychological relationship with winning had an almost compulsive quality to it. Winning was not a destination. It was a status that required continuous defense. Winter described the scene after that first championship in terms that stay with you. After they won the first one, he said, Michael was in the gym before the parade was over. Not literally, but emotionally. His mind was already on next year. You could see it in his eyes during the celebration. He was already gone. The clearest expression of the winner's standard principle comes in Jordan's stated response to the question of legacy. He has been asked, in numerous interviews, what he wants to be remembered for. The answers vary in their specifics, but they converge on a single principle. He wants to be remembered as a winner, not as a scorer, not as an entertainer, not as a cultural icon, as a winner. When they talk about the best, he said, he wanted his name to be there, not the best scorer. The best, period. This definition of self through winning is what drove the second three-peat. After the first retirement, after the baseball experiment, after everything the man had already achieved, the return to basketball was motivated by a single metric, the championships column. He needed more championships. Not because the world required them of him, but because the winner's standard he had defined for himself required them. The pattern of insisting on the championship standard appears in Jordan's stated attitudes toward players he respects and those he does not. He has been consistently resistant to acknowledging the greatness of players who did not win championships. His standards for greatness are inseparable from winning at the highest level. This has generated controversy in the years since his retirement. He has been reluctant to anoint certain contemporary players as his equals or successors, citing their championship records. Whether this standard is fair is a separate question. What it reveals is the internal consistency of Jordan's framework. The winner's standard is not applied selectively. It is applied universally, including to himself. Standards are easy to articulate and difficult to maintain. Most people hold high standards in moments of aspiration and lower them in moments of fatigue or convenience. Jordan's winner's standard appears to have been genuinely non-negotiable. His 6 championships are the result not just of extraordinary talent, but of a standard of success that refused every substitute. This is one of the most important lessons his career provides, not the specifics of what he wanted to achieve, but the structural commitment to defining success at the highest possible level and refusing to accept less. Across 20 years of professional basketball and nearly a decade of public life before that, certain patterns in Jordan's behavior and psychology repeat with a consistency that reveals the deep structure of how he operated. Every significant setback in Jordan's career, the Laney High School cut, the Detroit Pistons losses, the 1995 Orlando elimination, the difficult second Washington season, was processed not as damage, but as material. Jordan converted pain into motivation, then into preparation, then into performance. The conversion was deliberate and systematic. This pattern repeats at every stage of his career without exception. It is worth noting that this conversion was not effortless. Jordan has spoken about how genuinely difficult the Detroit losses were. The pain was real. The processing was the work. At no point in Jordan's career did he arrive at a version of himself and declare it sufficient. After every success, he identified what had worked and what could be improved. After every failure, he performed the same analysis. The result was an athlete who was continuously being upgraded. The 22-year-old Jordan and the 35-year-old Jordan were completely different players in terms of technical execution. The thread connecting them was the mental framework. The same principles applied to different physical tools. Jordan consistently sought out higher stakes situations rather than lower ones. When practice scrimmages were low intensity, he raised them. When games seemed to be in hand, he intensified his own engagement rather than easing off. When championships were won, he immediately elevated his focus to defending them. This pattern, the deliberate pursuit of higher stakes, ensured that he was perpetually operating at the edge of his capabilities. The edge is where growth happens. Jordan spent most of his career living at that edge. Despite his famous competitiveness, Jordan showed a consistent and often underappreciated intellectual respect for quality opponents. He studied them carefully, not just to defeat them, but because understanding a great opponent was, to him, an act of recognition. His relationships with Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Charles Barkley, and other contemporaries of the first tier were marked by genuine mutual respect. The competitive fire did not prevent him from recognizing excellence in others. In fact, it required him to recognize it, because acknowledged excellence was more satisfying to defeat than excellence that was dismissed. This pattern distinguishes Jordan from many elite competitors who manage their anxiety by minimizing their opponents. Jordan managed his anxiety by overestimating his opponents, which drove him to prepare more thoroughly and compete more fiercely. Jordan's career operated on a timeline that most athletes do not maintain. He remembered the specific causes of specific defeats. He referenced comments made years earlier in current competitive contexts. He treated each performance not as a standalone event, but as a chapter in a continuous narrative. This long memory was both a strength and a limitation. It fueled his sustained motivation across decades. It also meant that Jordan carried competitive grievances for longer than was perhaps healthy, and that his competitive relationships with teammates, rivals, and organizational figures were never entirely free from the weight of historical record. But for understanding his sustained excellence, the long memory is a crucial piece of architecture. It ensured that the lessons of failure were never fully forgotten. The defeats of 1988 informed the preparation of 1991. The losses of 1995 informed the championship run of 1996. The timeline was continuous and coherent. At the end of a long study of any exceptional career, the question resolves not into superlatives, but into structure. What was the underlying architecture? What were the load-bearing elements of the system? In Jordan's case, the architecture was built on 10 load-bearing principles. The ledger of slights, his personal motivation infrastructure, the practice standard, the refusal to allow preparation to drop below performance level, the study of opponents, intelligence gathering as competitive preparation, the will to adapt, the continuous rebuilding of self when the current version was no longer sufficient, the demanding leadership, elevation through confrontation rather than comfort, the relationship with failure, processing defeat as information rather than damage, the embrace of systems, channeling individual excellence through structural intelligence, the body as instrument, the maintenance of physical infrastructure with professional rigor, the performance identity, the total fusion of self-concept and competitive role, and the winner's standard, the refusal of every definition of success that fell short of the championship. None of these principles, in isolation, is extraordinary. Athletes across sports history have been motivated by slights. Athletes have worked hard and studied opponents and adapted their games. What made Jordan's architecture exceptional was not the individual elements. It was the completeness of the system. Every element reinforced the others. The ledger of slights powered the practice standard. The practice standard enabled the physical maintenance. The physical maintenance extended the career long enough for the will to adapt to produce a second championship run. The study of opponents informed the leadership model. The leadership model elevated the team to a level where the system and the individual could function together. There were no gaps in the architecture. Every element was connected to every other element. 6 championships, 6 finals MVP awards, 5 league MVP awards, 14 all-star appearances, 10 scoring titles, 1 defensive player of the year, 1 Olympic gold medal in 1984, another in 1992, rookie of the year. The logo. The record is what it is. It does not require advocacy. It does not require protection from comparison. But the record, important as it is the output. What this study has been concerned with is the input. The inputs were the 10 principles described above, applied consistently, Across 20 years, under conditions of extraordinary pressure and public scrutiny, in a sport that was continuously evolving to meet and counter the specific capabilities of the man applying them. And they held, under the weight of 3 championships and 2 retirements and a murder and a gambling controversy, and the construction of an entire alternative competitive identity, and then a second championship run, and then a third career at Washington, and then 30 years of post-retirement public life, they held. Any honest analysis of Jordan's career must include a note on what the framework cost him. The performance identity that produced extraordinary excellence also produced extraordinary difficulty outside competition. Jordan has spoken with candor about the challenges of his personal life, the cost that his competitive intensity placed on his relationships, his first marriage, his friendships with certain teammates who could not meet his standard or who were damaged by his demands. The ledger of slights is a remarkable motivational tool. It is also a way of living that requires perpetual grievance, a continuous low-level activation of competitive resentment that does not easily turn off when the competition ends. The winner's standard produces championships. It also produces a specific kind of loneliness, the loneliness of a standard so high that very few people can meet you where you are, and the difficulty of inhabiting a world where most people are not, by your definition, operating at a meaningful level. These are not moral judgments. They are observations about the full cost of the architecture. Jordan's career is a case study in what happens when a specific set of mental tools is applied with complete consistency over a sustained period of time. It is a case study in the compounding effects of preparation. It is a case study in the relationship between identity and performance, in how deeply the image of oneself as a competitor, as a winner, as someone who does not accept the available reward when the highest reward is still achievable, can drive human behavior. The tools are not secret. None of them were invented by Jordan. Athletes before him maintained practice standards. Athletes before him studied opponents. Athletes before him converted failure into motivation. What Jordan did was apply them all simultaneously, without compromise, across an entire career. That is the architecture of winning. And that is what makes it worth studying. Some people want it to happen. Some wish it would happen. Others make it happen. Michael Jordan.